Welcome to Conversations About Grief. Here's our hosts, Steve Davis and the Reverend Ed Arneson.
Hi, welcome to Conversations About Grief. I'm Steve Davis. This is Reverend Ed Arneson. This is going to be a little bit different today. We're going to talk about the origin story for Conversations About Grief.
It's good to be with you again today from rainy and wet East Texas. I've been thinking since we started this that perhaps we missed a step in the process. One of the things that happens with me is almost 2 or 3 times or more weekly, someone will speak to me and I will discover in the conversation that they're dealing with grief. I have a neighbor here where we live and I visit with her occasionally. And so she stopped and we started talking and I asked her, and then I discovered that her brother, who was a relatively young man, had died. And so we started a conversation about grief. There are those folks who want to start in something like this with kind of grandiose ideas and dreams of what it will be. But what motivates me, and I believe with all my heart motivates Steve too, is that what we want to do is try to help people be able to have a place where they can talk about it safely, where they may gain a little bit of information from our knowledge base, our experience, and most especially where we can learn from you, where what you say to us helps us understand better what we're trying to do. I continuously am struck by how much during the pandemic that grief has moved among us almost like a fog. It has touched so many people in so many ways. And for us, for me, it is so troubling to think that almost 600,000 of our fellow citizens died from this disease, and that their grief, the families who grieved, has to have been intense. Many of these people died alone. I used to know this psychiatrist from Ireland who was a hospice physician and a brilliant young man. And one of his favorite sayings was, dying is not the worst thing that happens. Dying alone is the worst thing that happens. I think you could say grieving alone and having no one who can speak to that grief with you is almost as bad as dying alone.
Yes, I would agree with that. One of the things I wanted to do when we got together on this idea for this podcast, Conversations About Grief, nobody had ever really taught me how to grieve. And I would say that most people don't know how to grieve. There's certain things that we may have seen others do that we think, okay, that's acceptable for grief. That's what you do. That's it. And then things happen. The first conversation I ever had with my neighbor Ed about grief was about a 10-minute conversation, and I learned more in 10 minutes than I had in the previous 48 and a half years of my life. Because the people who had attempted to teach me about grief at whatever level, whether it was at church, other organizations, not that I was ever in a grief organization, but professional organizations where somebody may have mentioned it and talked about various aspects of senior care, things like that, then the subject of grief comes up for just a brief moment and then goes away. Nobody had ever mentioned how to effectively grieve. And I think this is one of the things, especially as a society, as a nation, just as the world in general, we don't know how to grieve. We don't know how to effectively grieve. And there are people that in various stages, some of them continuously, like you were telling me the story about the one person that, after 20 years, they're still at the first stage of grief. And some people may or may not progress past that. I don't know. Personally, before I had met Ed, my way of dealing with grief was compartmentalize it, tamp it down, move on. And that is not effective because that does come back various times. Like I mentioned in the previous episode, that 6, 7 years after my father passed, a friend from way back that I knew from school, his father passed. I knew the father, I knew him. And it was just like everything happened to my dad that day. It just, everything came back. So there has to be some time set aside for grieving, some ways to learn about grieving. That's the purpose of this channel.
I think, as I've said to you before, one of the problems we have as we try to talk about grief is that folks have so experienced an individualized event. I've lost my mama, I've lost my wife, I've lost my daughter, I've lost my whomever. And there is a way in which it seems to be invasive for someone else to start talking about grief and to say, as difficult as it is to get, grief is a process. It has some equal or some recognizable parts. They may not all come in, and that's the problem we have with steps. They may not all come in any chronological order, and they may come and go and come and go. And so being able to say, we understand, we care that your loss is personal. We know that. Our losses have been personal. Some of them are things that you never, ever totally are able to get at rest with. I have some of those. You know the process, you understand, and you just have a difficult time. And as we try to do this, as we try to speak to what is obviously a moment of considerable pain, a time of considerable pain and difficulty, we want to do it with all the compassion, all the care, and frankly, all the love we can demonstrate, that being able to speak to your grief. I mentioned before that there are a lot of people who've written, and every scholar who's written about grief tries to break it down into some kind of usable component so you can think more clearly about it. No one thinks that your grief is not individual. No one thinks that your grief is not different than anyone else's in the world. Your experience of loss is different than anyone else's in the world because your relationship that you lost is different. However, there are ways in which you can find signposts, you can find opportunities, you can find one of the things, as an aside, I traveled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and every once in a while you would have these drive-offs where you were off the road and you had this beautiful scenery and you could take a minute and look. And sometimes the movement, the moments in grief require that. There's some things that are absolutely unavoidable. You cannot grieve without pain. You're going to hurt. The hurt is not forever. And the things that people worry about, if I could, I hardly remember ever speaking to someone who was actively grieving that didn't use this phrase, I think I'm losing my mind. And you could safely assure them they are not. And that folks would often say, I'm confused. And there are a lot of other things. So the major point we want to make today is that it matters that you grieve. It matters that you have lost someone so special to you. It matters that you may have lost someone who was antagonistic to you and you to them, and that creates its own special form of grieving. As a person of faith, as a Christian, I believe that God gives us the grace to grieve, that it's okay, that it doesn't change our relationship to God. It doesn't create any kind of doubt between us and God. So what I would say today is we started out of a genuine caring. We don't think we've got all the answers. We don't think we're the hot shots. We don't think we are the final authority on anything. What we think and what we feel and what we hope is that we can provide for you an opportunity perhaps to learn, perhaps to share, and perhaps to broaden our understanding and help us to be better at what we really honestly want to do.
Yes, yes, thank you. One thing, if you do have questions about grief, I know in the first video I mentioned, put them in the comments below. I created a Gmail account, conversationsaboutgrief@gmail.com. If you will email your questions to us, that way they're not out there for, I know sometimes on various platforms online, you get certain abuse dished onto you. People see something and then that's how things go viral. We don't want that. Email us and we can answer your question for you on any questions you have on upcoming episodes that we'll have. But conversationsaboutgrief@gmail.com. You can send us your questions in full confidentiality. We can answer them on the podcast. We will not use your name or your situation, but we can answer your questions effectively. We can know more what things that Ed can help you with. And basically, Ed is the one with all the grief experience. I'm the one that knows how to press buttons and make things show up online.
Thank you. I pray and hope that your grief will not be overwhelming, and that you will see that's a process, the end of which will bring you a new kind of life. Have a great day, and we appreciate you joining us here today.
Thanks, everybody. See you on the next episode.
Say what you need to say. Say what you need to say. Say what you need to say.
Thank you for listening today. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel. If you have any questions about grief, please email us at conversationsaboutgrief@gmail.com.